The engines were dying. Not all at once, not with the clean drama of a sudden flame, but slowly, unevenly, the way a wounded animal stumbles before it falls. 3 of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines aboard that B-17 had been torn apart by German flak and fighter rounds somewhere above the frozen city of Bremen, and what remained was a mechanical groan so deep and so wrong that 21-year-old Charlie Brown could feel it in his sternum before he could hear it in his ears. The airplane was shaking itself apart at 27,000 feet, and the German coast was still 40 miles behind them, and England might as well have been on the moon. The nose of the aircraft had been ripped open, not damaged, not dented, but ripped, peeled back like the lid of a can by the force of an 88-millimeter burst that had detonated close enough to spray shrapnel through the plexiglass and across the face of the bombardier. The wind was howling through that gaping wound at temperatures that turned breath into ice crystals and exposed flesh into dead meat within minutes. The oxygen system was gone. The electrical system was gone. The interphone that connected the crew to one another had been shot to pieces somewhere over the target. And each man in that airplane was alone inside his own small hell, unable to speak to the man 3 feet away, unable to know whether anyone else was still alive. Charlie Brown had blood on his face. Some of it was his own. He had taken a fragment of something, metal or plexiglass, along the left side of his head, and the wound had bled freely into his eye until the cold air sealed it shut with a crust of frozen red. He could see out of one eye. With that one eye, he looked at the instrument panel and understood, in the quiet, clinical way that extreme shock produces, that the airplane he was flying was no longer really an airplane. It was a collection of metal parts that had not yet finished the process of falling. And somewhere in the sky behind him, he knew there were German fighters and they would find him. And that would be the end of everything. He was right about the fighters. He just had no way of knowing what one of them was going to do. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was, by the winter of 1943, the most famous airplane in the world. It had been designed in the middle of the previous decade by a team of Boeing engineers who were working under a War Department specification that called for a bomber capable of carrying a substantial bomb load at high altitude over long distances. The prototype had first flown in July 1935, and the journalists who watched that initial test flight were struck by the bristling machine gun turrets positioned around the fuselage like the guns of a battleship. Someone wrote that it looked like a flying fortress, and the name stuck, and the marketing department at Boeing had the good sense to make it official. The name was not entirely wrong. The B-17 was not fast, not maneuverable, not subtle. What it was tough. It was built to absorb punishment the way a good heavyweight absorbs body shots, leaning into them, grinding forward, refusing to go down. The F model, which was the variant that Charlie Brown flew that December morning, had a wingspan of just over 103 feet and a length of 74 feet, and it weighed, when fully loaded with fuel and bombs and 10 men and their equipment, something close to 65,000 pounds. It was powered by 4 Wright R1820-97 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower at takeoff. And together they could push the airplane to a maximum speed of around 300 miles per hour at altitude, though the practical cruising speed on a mission was considerably less than that. The service ceiling was officially 35,000 feet, though in practice the airplane became increasingly miserable above 25,000. Not because the airframe could not take the altitude, but because the men inside it could barely survive it. The temperature at 25,000 feet over northern Europe in December is not a temperature that the human body was designed to endure, and the flight suits and heated boots and oxygen masks that the 8th Air Force issued to its crews were a partial solution at best. The defensive armament of the B-17F was the reason for the name, and it was the reason that American strategic planners had convinced themselves in the early months of the war that the airplane could defend itself against fighter attack without a fighter escort. 13 50-caliber machine guns were distributed around the aircraft in a configuration designed to ensure that no approach angle was completely undefended. There were guns in the nose, guns in the tail, guns in the top turret, guns in the ball turret, slung beneath the belly, guns in the waist positions where gunners stood at open windows in temperatures that no one sane would voluntarily endure, and a chin turret that had been added to the F model specifically because earlier variants had proven vulnerable to head-on attacks by German fighters who had learned to approach from directly in front, where the defensive fire was weakest. The theory was elegant. The practice was a great deal more complicated, because theory does not account for flak that tears the nose off an airplane before the guns have a chance to fire, and theory does not account for the moment when the oxygen runs out and the gunner in the top turret begins to drift toward unconsciousness and can no longer keep his hands on the triggers. Charlie Brown had not expected to be flying a combat mission on December 20th, 1943. He had not expected to be doing much of anything on December 20th, 1943, because 3 weeks earlier, he had been sitting in a classroom in Nebraska, learning in the slow, methodical way that the Army Air Forces taught everything, the theory and practice of 4-engine bomber operations. He had graduated from flight training with above-average marks, and his instructors had noted that he had steady hands and good instrument scan, and the particular quality of calm under pressure that the selection committees were looking for. What they could not test for, because there is no way to test for it on the ground, was how a man responds when the airplane he is flying is falling apart and the people in it are dying, and the instruments are telling him things that make no sense and his own body is fighting him, because the cold has gotten into his fingers and the blood has gotten into his eye, and some part of his brain is suggesting very politely but very insistently that the rational response to this situation is to stop trying. He had been assigned to the 379th Bombardment Group at Kimballton in Cambridgeshire and Ye Old Pub, as his aircraft had been named by a previous crew who had decorated the nose with a painting of a rotund barkeep serving ale, was the airplane he had been assigned. He had flown it twice before December 20th, both times on missions that had gone more or less as planned, which is to say they had been frightening and exhausting and had killed men in other airplanes around him, but he had come home. The third mission was Bremen. Bremen in December 1943 was one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. The city sat on the Weser River in the north of the country, close enough to the coast that an attacking force had to penetrate the full depth of the German air defense network to reach it, and the network over Bremen was particularly dense. The flak batteries were positioned in overlapping fields of fire, and the fighters of the Jagdwaffe were scrambled from airfields along the entire length of the approach route. And the forecasters who had predicted clear skies over the target had been wrong, which meant that the bombing formations had to drop through cloud with imperfect accuracy and absorb the full weight of the German defenses without the compensation of hitting what they had come to hit. Ye Old Pub was hit on the bomb run. The first burst took the nose. Subsequent hits walked up the left side of the fuselage, punching through the aluminum skin with the indifferent efficiency of something that does not care what it destroys, and by the time Brown had the aircraft clear of the target area and turned on a westward heading for the coast, 3 of the 4 engines were damaged, one of them visibly on fire, and the crew was in a condition that ranged from dead to barely functional. The tail gunner was dead. The navigator was wounded badly enough that he had lost consciousness before he could give Brown a heading. The top turret gunner had passed out from hypoxia when the oxygen system went down. 2 of the waist gunners were wounded. The bombardier, who had been in the nose when the first burst came through, had survived by a margin so small it could not be calculated, and he was now trying to help Brown manage the airplane with fingers that no longer felt like fingers, and a mind that was operating at some fraction of its normal capacity. They were flying west because west was the direction of England, and England was the direction of survival, and they were losing altitude because 3 damaged engines and a structural airframe that had been open to the sky could not maintain altitude, and they were alone because the formation had left them behind, which was not callousness but mathematics, because a formation that slows down for its wounded is a formation that loses more airplanes, and the commanders who made that policy had made it with full knowledge of what it meant for the crews who fell behind. What does it feel like to be in an airplane that is dying? Not dying in the dramatic, cinematic sense of spinning flames and screaming altimeters, but dying in the slow, industrial sense of systems failing one by one, of the cumulative weight of damage building, until the machine can no longer do what machines are supposed to do. There is a vibration that comes through the control column when an engine is misfiring, a particular shudder that any experienced pilot learns to recognize and to fear, because it means that the carefully balanced system of thrust and lift and drag that keeps a multi-engine aircraft in the air is becoming unbalanced, and unbalanced systems tend toward the worst possible outcome. Brown could feel that vibration in his palms and his shoulders and the base of his spine, and he was compensating for it through the rudder pedals and the aileron controls with corrections that were becoming larger as the asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine pulled the nose to the left. And he was doing all of this with one usable eye and blood-stiff fingers, and the knowledge that somewhere above and behind him there were German fighters who were very good at their jobs. He was right to worry about the fighters because they found him. A pair of Bf-109s came down from altitude in the textbook bounce that the Jagdwaffe had refined over 4 years of air combat, and they made their passes. And several things happened that should not have happened. Their guns failed to finish the job. This was not unusual in the high-altitude environment of December over northern Germany, where gun mechanisms froze and lubricants thickened, and the precision engineering of a fighter aircraft's armament systems became subject to the laws of thermodynamics. The Germans made their passes and their guns jammed, or their aim was off, or the intervening hand of something that has no name in the technical manuals intervened, and ye old pub was still in the air. Still losing altitude, still shaking, still bleeding oil and hydraulic fluid in thin, dark streams that the slipstream pulled into feathers behind the wings, but still in the air. And then came Oberleutnant Franz Stigler. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G6 was, by December 1943, the most produced fighter aircraft in the history of aviation, which is a distinction that carries with it all the implications of industrial warfare, the idea that the quality of the individual machine is secondary to the quantity in which it can be manufactured and the speed with which it can be put into service. This is not entirely fair to the Bf-109, which was a superb fighter in many respects and a genuinely difficult one in others. It had been designed by Willy Messerschmitt's team in the early 1930s as a response to a Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium specification, and the prototype had first flown in September 1935, which meant that by the winter of 1943, it was an 8-year-old design that had been stretched and upgraded and modified to the absolute limit of what the basic airframe could tolerate, and then stretched a little further. The G6 variant, which was the version being flown by most Jagdwaffe units by late 1943, had been equipped with heavier armament at the cost of some of the handling qualities that had made the earlier marks so effective in the hands of skilled pilots. It carried two 13mm MG-131 machine guns in the upper fuselage, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, and it could be fitted with a motor cannon, a cannon mounted in the engine block and firing through the hollow propeller shaft, typically a 20mm MG-151 or the devastating 30mm Mk-108. The Mk-108 deserves a moment of attention because it is relevant to what Franz Stigler chose not to do on the afternoon of December the 20th, 1943. The 30mm cannon was a weapon of extraordinary destructive power in an aerial context. A single hit from a 30mm round could take a wing off a single-engine fighter. 3 hits from a 30mm round, fired into the right place on a B-17, were considered statistically sufficient to destroy it. 3 rounds against an airplane that had been flying for 4 years on the principle that it could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. 3 rounds. Franz Stigler had 3 rounds left when he found Ye Old Pub. Franz Stigler was not a young man by the standards of the Jagdwaffe in December 1943, which is to say he was 27 years old. He had been flying combat missions since before the war, having volunteered with the Legion Condor in Spain, and he had continued to fly through the campaigns in Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, and the North African Theater before being reassigned to the defense of the Reich. He had accumulated an aerial victory score of 22 confirmed kills, which placed him in the upper tier of Jagdwaffe pilots without quite reaching the stratospheric numbers of the genuine aces, the Hartmanns, and the Grafs, who seemed to live in a different universe of aerial combat. He needed 1 more confirmed kill to qualify for the Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross, which was the highest military decoration that the Wehrmacht routinely awarded, and which conferred on its wearer a kind of celebrity status in wartime Germany that had significant practical benefits for a pilot's career, and considerably more significant practical benefits for a pilot's chances of surviving the war. He had been on the ground refueling and rearming after an earlier engagement when Ye Old Pub came low over his airfield. He scrambled. This was not an unusual response to a wounded bomber. Disabled aircraft that were separated from their formations were considered relatively easy kills, and a pilot who needed 1 more victory to receive the Knight's Cross could be forgiven for seeing an opportunity in a B-17 that was flying on 1 good engine and leaving a trail of smoke and fluid across the winter sky. He climbed, he intercepted, and he pulled alongside the airplane and looked through the plexiglass of his canopy at what remained of it. What he saw changed everything. The tail gunner's position was empty, which meant the tail gunner was dead. Through the waist gun windows, he could see men who were not at their guns, who were slumped or moving weakly or simply lying on the floor of the aircraft in the way that men lie when they are too hurt to move. The nose of the airplane, the section that would normally be occupied by the bombardier and the navigator, had been torn away, and through the opening he could see daylight on the other side of the fuselage. The aircraft was leaving a vapor trail of leaking oxygen and a darker trail of leaking oil, and it was descending so slowly that the rate of descent was almost imperceptible The slow inevitability of a machine that is not so much flying as postponing its own impact with the ground. The guns of the B-17 were silent. There was no one to man them. There was nothing left with which to fight. Stigler brought his BF-109 alongside the B-17, close enough that he could have reached out and touched the wing, close enough that through the damaged plexiglass of the nose section, he could see Charlie Brown's face, the one-eyed, blood-streaked face of a boy who had not yet turned 22 years old, looking back at him. Brown saw the German fighter and closed his eyes. He did not attempt evasion. He did not call for return fire. He closed his eyes and waited for the end because there was nothing else to do, and because the end seemed not only inevitable, but appropriate. The logical conclusion of an afternoon that had been building toward this moment since the first flak burst came through the nose over Bremen. The end did not come. Stigler looked at the airplane and he thought about a man named Gustav Rodel, who had been his commanding officer in Africa, and who had told him once, in the blunt way that good officers sometimes speak the most important truths, that if he ever shot at a man in a parachute, he would shoot him himself. It was not a legal instruction. It was not derived from the rules of war or the conventions of armed conflict, though those conventions existed and Stigler knew them. It was something older and simpler, a principle that existed in the space between the formal codes of military conduct and the informal codes by which men who fight decide who they are willing to become. Stigler looked at the dying airplane and the dying men inside it, and he thought about what it would mean to pull the trigger, and he decided that he could not do it. What he did instead is one of the most extraordinary things that the air war over Germany produced, and the air war over Germany produced extraordinary things in abundance. He pulled his fighter alongside the B-17, and he tried to signal Brown. He pointed toward the coast of Sweden, which was to the north, and he pointed downward, which meant land this airplane while you still can. Brown, who was operating on the last reserves of a mind and body that had been pushed far beyond their designed limits, did not understand. He stared at the German pilot with his one useful eye, and he did not understand, and Stigler tried again, pointing north toward Sweden, pointing down toward the ground, making the gestures of a man who is trying to communicate something urgent across a barrier that has no words. Brown still did not understand, or if he understood, he could not act on it, because landing in Sweden meant giving up, and giving up was something that the training had not prepared him to do. Stigler made a decision. If Brown would not land, then Brown would have to be protected for as long as possible. He pulled his BF-109 into a position alongside and slightly behind the B-17, close enough that any German fighter pilot approaching for an attack run would be able to see him, and the meaning of his presence there would be clear. He was not attacking. He was escorting. And any German pilot who approached that wounded bomber would have to wonder what the Oberleutnant in the 109 was doing there, and the wondering would cost time, and time over the North Sea in December is not a luxury that attacking fighter pilots have to spare. What was Stigler thinking in those minutes? We have his words recorded decades later in the careful reconstruction of events the two old men undertook when they finally found each other again after nearly half a century. He said that it felt like shooting at a man with a parachute. He said that the sight of those wounded men in that destroyed aircraft made it impossible for him to do what he had come to do. He said that he saluted. This last detail is the one that has attached itself most firmly to the popular memory of the event, the image of a German fighter pilot saluting an American crew that he had decided, in defiance of everything his country required of him and everything his career demanded to allow to live. Whether the salute happened exactly as described, whether it was a formal military salute or a simpler gesture of acknowledgement, is less important than the principle it represents. At some point in the winter sky above the North Sea, Franz Stigler recognized Charlie Brown not as an enemy but as a fellow airman, and the recognition was sufficient to override everything else. He escorted the B-17 to the edge of German-controlled airspace. Then he peeled away and turned back toward Germany, and the last Charlie Brown saw of him was the silhouette of a Bf-109 growing smaller against the gray of the winter sky and then gone. The survival of Ye Old Pub after that escort ended was not a foregone conclusion. The airplane was still in terrible condition, still losing altitude, still trying to hold itself together through the sheer obstinacy of well-built aluminum. Brown was still operating half-blind, still managing the controls through hands that had lost much of their sensation to the cold, still trying to keep the nose pointed west and the wings level despite the asymmetric thrust of the one reliable engine. The crew was still in the condition the German fighters had left them in, some of them unconscious, some of them wounded beyond their capacity to help, some of them doing what they could to apply pressure to wounds and drag their crewmates away from the open gaps in the airframe through which the wind was trying to pull them. The crossing of the North Sea in a disabled heavy bomber is a prospect that should be taken seriously. The North Sea in December is not a place where men survive for long in the water. The water temperature is close to freezing, and a man who goes into the water in December without an immersion suit will lose consciousness within minutes and die within an hour, and the crews of heavy bombers did not wear immersion suits because the additional bulk would have made it impossible to move in the cramped interiors of the aircraft. Every crew that crossed the North Sea in a damaged airplane knew that the threshold between aviation and drowning was measured in inches of altitude and percentage points of engine output, and the calculations that Brown was making as he flew were the calculations of a man who understands exactly how thin the margin is. The English coast appeared. This is the moment in the account that always seems almost too neat, too convenient, the kind of resolution that fiction would be criticized for contrivance. But geography is not interested in narrative convenience, and the English coast was simply there, below and ahead, exactly where the navigation charts had said it would be. Brown got the airplane across the coastline and found a runway at Seething in Norfolk, and put the B-17 down with the particular controlled violence of a landing made by a pilot who has no confidence in the landing gear and no certainty about the hydraulic system and no margin for a go-around if the approach goes wrong. The airplane stopped. The crew got out. Some of them required assistance. The tail gunner did not get out because the tail gunner was already gone. The debrief was conducted by intelligence officers who were trained to extract information from men who had just returned from combat, and they were good at their jobs. Brown told them what had happened over the North Sea. He told them about the German fighter that had come alongside and had not fired, and had seemed to be directing him toward Sweden or toward the ground, and had then escorted him toward the coast. The intelligence officers listened and made notes and then told Brown, as gently as the situation allowed, that what he was describing was not consistent with documented German tactics or behavior, and that his recollection was likely the product of hypoxia and shock and the extreme stress of the mission, and that the official record would reflect what the instruments and the damage assessment confirmed, which was that Ye Old Pub had returned from Bremen with catastrophic battle damage, and the crew's survival was a testament to their skill and endurance. Brown accepted this because he was 21 years old, and the intelligence officers were his superiors, and the system within which he operated had its own logic and its own requirements. He flew more missions. He completed his tour. He came home. He did not forget what had happened over the North Sea, but he filed it in the part of his mind where men file the things they are not sure they are allowed to believe, and he did not speak of it often. Franz Stigler told no one. This was not difficult to understand. What he had done, allowing an enemy bomber to escape when he had the means and the mandate to destroy it, was not something that the Jagdwaffe would have looked upon with understanding. The Knight's Cross that he needed one more kill to receive would not have been awarded to a pilot who had declined a certain kill on grounds of personal conscience. He might have faced charges. He kept his silence with the efficiency of a man who understands that some things are safer as secrets, and he flew more missions, and the war continued its vast and indifferent grinding through the lives of the men who were caught in it. The Gustav Rodel principle that Stigler invoked when he looked at that battered B-17 was not articulated anywhere in the formal regulations of the Luftwaffe. It was not written in any manual. It was the product of a tradition that existed in the officer corps of most professional air forces in the early years of combat aviation, a tradition that held that the fight was between pilots as much as between nations, and that certain basic standards of conduct should be maintained regardless of what the broader political context required. This tradition was older than the airplane itself, having its roots in the chivalric codes of cavalry warfare, and in the early aerial combats of the First World War, when pilots who had just tried to kill each other sometimes landed in the same field and shared a meal. It was a tradition that the industrialization and ideologization of the Second World War had largely destroyed. The bombing campaigns that the Allies were conducting over Germany in December 1943 were not the kind of thing that the chivalric tradition had been designed to address. They were not duels between individual warriors. They were systematic efforts to destroy the industrial capacity and civilian morale of an entire nation, conducted at a scale that made individual human decisions seem irrelevant to the outcome. And yet, Franz Stigler looked at that airplane and made an individual human decision. And the decision was not irrelevant to the men inside the airplane, because the men inside the airplane are alive today, or were alive and until the ordinary processes of mortality claimed them because of that decision. Charlie Brown went home. He married. He had children and grandchildren, and a life that would not have existed if Stigler had pulled the trigger. The ripples from a single decision spread forward through time in ways that are impossible to trace completely, but that are no less real for being invisible. For nearly 50 years, the story of that meeting over the North Sea existed only in the private memories of two men who had decided, for different reasons, not to speak of it. Brown was in his 60s when he began to feel that the story deserved to be told, and he began searching for the German pilot who had escorted him home. This was not a simple undertaking. The passage of nearly half a century had dispersed the relevant records and the relevant witnesses across the geography of a world that had been reorganized by the war's outcome, and the man he was looking for had, after the war, emigrated to Canada and then to the United States, which was its own small irony. Stigler had settled in Vancouver and had built a life as a businessman and had not, in the public record, been identified as the pilot of the BF-109 that had escorted a dying B-17 toward England in December 1943. Brown placed an advertisement in a newsletter for German fighter pilot veterans, describing what he was looking for and Stigler read the advertisement and recognized the description and wrote a letter. The letter arrived in 1990. Brown and Stigler met, and the meeting between two old men who had nearly killed each other and had instead saved each other's life was conducted with the particular emotional register of men of their generation, which is to say that it was not conducted with the emotional register of men who weep openly about things, but that it was nonetheless overwhelming in the way that the reunion of people separated by circumstance for 50 years is always overwhelming. They became friends. They remained friends until they died. Brown in 2008, Stigler in 2008 also, within months of each other, which is the kind of coincidence that a novelist would be advised not to include in a novel. The story was written down and published eventually in a book called A Higher Call by Adam Makos, which is the primary source for the detailed reconstruction of the events of December 20th, 1943. The title refers to the higher calling that Stigler had invoked when he decided not to fire, the principle that places the life of an individual human being above the requirements of a military campaign or national ideology. This is not a politically neutral principle. It has implications for how we think about the conduct of war and the relationship between individual conscience and institutional obligation, and those implications are not comfortable. Stigler's decision was, by any strict reading of his military duty, wrong. It was also, by the standard that he had been taught by the officer who told him he would shoot him himself if he shot at a man in a parachute. Exactly right. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 that Franz Stigler flew that December has not survived. The specific airframe, the individual machine that he climbed into after refueling and rearming on that airfield near Bremen, was almost certainly destroyed in the subsequent months of the war, which consumed aircraft with an appetite that made the survival of individual machines exceptional rather than typical. There are surviving Bf-109 G variants in museums around the world, enough that the type is not merely a memory but a physical presence in several collections, and the aircraft at these museums sometimes attract visitors who know the story of December 20th, 1943, and who stand before the angular silhouette of the fighter and try to imagine the moment when one man in one of these machines made a decision that should not have been possible in the context in which it was made. There are more surviving B-17S than surviving Bf-109S, which reflects both the different production numbers and the different fates of the two countries' industrial infrastructure at the end of the war. Several B-17S are airworthy today, and they appear at air shows and memorial events. They're four Cyclone engines producing a sound that people who were alive in the 1940s describe as the sound of the war, the particular heavy synchronized thunder of radial engines in multiples that was the constant background music of the air war over Europe. When one of these aircraft flies over, it is not difficult to understand why the men who flew them developed the complicated relationship with their machines that the record documents. You are not indifferent to something that size and that loud and that capable of keeping you alive. You give it a name and a personality and a history, because the alternative is to acknowledge that you are sitting inside a collection of metal and rubber and oil-soaked canvas at 25,000 feet in December, and that acknowledgement is not compatible with the continued performance of your duties. Ye Old Pub, the specific aircraft that Charlie Brown flew on December 20th, 1943, did not survive the war. It was lost on a subsequent mission. The details are in the records of the 379th Bombardment Group, which maintained careful documentation of its aircraft and crews throughout its time in England. And the record shows the date of loss and the circumstances and the names of the crew, and it has the quality of military records everywhere, which is the quality of bureaucratic precision applied to events that bureaucratic precision cannot adequately describe. The airplane is gone. The men who flew it are gone, most of them. What remains is the story. The story is not about airplanes ultimately, though the airplanes are essential to it. It is not about the strategic bombing campaign, though the campaign is the context that makes it possible. It is about the question that lies beneath all the technical specifications and tactical analyses and strategic assessments that the military historians produce when they describe the air war over Germany, which is the question of what a human being is and what a human being is capable of when the circumstances are as extreme as circumstances get. Charlie Brown was capable of holding a dying airplane in the air through will and training and the refusal to stop. Franz Stigler was capable of looking at a man he was supposed to kill and deciding that the man mattered more than the kill. These are different expressions of the same quality, and the quality does not have a good single name in English, though the languages of the cultures that produced these two men have various candidates. The air war over Germany killed, depending on which accounting you use, somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 civilians, and it killed 55,000 aircrew of RAF Bomber Command alone, and it killed tens of thousands more in the American 8th Air Force, and the moral accounting of those deaths and those decisions has been conducted by historians and philosophers and ordinary people for the 80 years since the war ended, and it will continue to be conducted, because the questions it raises do not have answers that are universally satisfying. But inside that vast and terrible accounting, there is this smaller story. 2 men and 2 aircraft and a decision made in the gray winter sky above the North Sea. And the smaller story is the kind of thing that makes the larger story bearable. Not because it changes the arithmetic, but because it demonstrates that the arithmetic is not the whole of what happened. There were men inside those numbers, and some of them, in the specific circumstances of their specific moments, were capable of something that exceeded what the circumstances required. Think about what Franz Stigler was giving up. 1 kill, 1 more confirmed kill, and the Knight's Cross was his. The Knight's Cross was not merely a medal. It was career advancement, public recognition, the concrete acknowledgement by the state whose uniform he wore that he had done what was asked of him at the highest possible level. He had been working toward it for 4 years of combat, through Spain and Poland and France and the Channel and Africa, and now the Reich Defense. He was within a single trigger pull of it, and he pulled his finger away from the trigger and put his airplane alongside the bomber and tried, in the pantomime of urgent gestures visible through 2 layers of plexiglass, to communicate something to a young man who was operating at the edge of what human beings can do, and who needed 1 more problem to solve approximately as much as he needed another hole in his airplane. And Brown. Consider Brown. He had been in combat 3 times. He was 21 years old. He had been wounded. His airplane was a wreck, and his crew was decimated. And he had been flying blind for most of the return journey, navigating by instinct and the direction of the sun through a sky that was not helping him. When the German fighter appeared alongside him, the rational response was despair, because there was nothing left with which to fight and nowhere to go. He did not despair. He managed the controls. He kept the airplane in the air. He crossed the North Sea. He landed. He went to the debrief and told the intelligence officers what had happened, and accepted their skepticism with the patience of a man who was too tired to argue, and then he went to sleep, and in the morning he was still alive, which is the most important thing he accomplished that day. Neither of these men were extraordinary in the biographical sense that produces legends. Brown was a farm boy from West Virginia who had learned to fly because the Army needed pilots and he had passed the tests. Stigler was a middle-class German who had learned to fly because the Luftwaffe needed pilots and he had been well suited to it. They were not heroes in the way that the concept of heroism is usually constructed, which is to say they had not demonstrated any particular heroic quality before, the moment that required it of them. They were competent professional military men who found themselves in a situation that could not have been predicted and that demanded something from them that no training had specifically prepared them to give, and they gave it. The Bf-109 that escorted Ye Old Pub to the edge of German-controlled airspace was, for the duration of that escort, neither a German fighter nor an enemy aircraft. It was a presence, a companion, a thing that had every reason to destroy and had chosen instead to protect. And the choice had been made not by the machine, but by the man inside it, who had looked at another man inside another machine and had recognized something that was more important than the score that either of them was keeping. This is the part of the story that is worth sitting with, and that repays repeated examination, not because it provides any answers to the large questions of the air war or the war itself, but because it demonstrates that those questions, as large as they are, do not exhaust what happened. The large questions are about forces and policies and strategies and outcomes. The small story is about two men who looked at each other through layers of plexiglass and aluminum in the gray sky over the North Sea in December 1943. And one of them saluted, and one of them went home. There is a detail that Stigler mentioned when he and Brown finally met and reconstructed the events of that afternoon. He said that when he pulled away and turned back toward Germany, he said a brief prayer for the crew of the B-17. This is the kind of detail that can be dismissed as the reconstruction of memory over 50 years, the embellishment that comes when men tell stories about their own best moments. It can also be taken at face value, which requires accepting that a German pilot in the service of the Third Reich, flying a combat mission in defense of a country that was conducting an industrial genocide on a scale that history had not previously seen, found the space in that specific moment to pray for the survival of the men he had just decided not to kill. The coexistence of those things is uncomfortable. It is also, the record suggests, accurate. And it is precisely this kind of uncomfortable accuracy that makes the story worth telling and retelling, because it does not simplify into a lesson, and the best stories never do. What would you have done in that cockpit? Not the comfortable version of the question, where you already know the outcome and you have the distance of 80 years between yourself and the decision. The real version. 3 rounds left in the cannon, 1 kill short of the decoration that your career has been building toward for 4 years. A B-17 in front of you that cannot fight back, that is clearly dying, that your instruments and your eyes are both telling you will not make it home, regardless of whether you fire. The war is not going well for your country, and the bombers that you do not shoot down today will come back tomorrow with more bombers behind them, and the city below you is burning, and the men you know are dying, and the man you are looking at through his broken windshield is the reason for all of it. What do you do? Stigler did not write down the answer, and he did not articulate it clearly in the interviews that preceded the book. And this is probably the most honest thing about him. The decision he made was not the product of a clear ethical analysis. It was the product of the kind of instantaneous recognition that bypasses analysis entirely. The knowledge that arrives before the reasoning, the certainty that comes from somewhere that cannot be located precisely, but that is, when it arrives, absolutely reliable. He knew he could not fire. That was all. The knowing preceded any explanation of why he knew, and the explanation he constructed afterward, the parachute comparison, the memory of Gustave Rodel's instruction, was the rationalization of a decision that had already been made at a level below rationalization. This is perhaps the most important thing about the story of December 20th, 1943. It is not a story about the rules of war, or the ethics of the bombing campaign, or the relative merits of the American and German approaches to strategic air power. It is a story about the moment when a human being acts from a place that is more fundamental than any of the frameworks that societies construct to explain and justify human action. A place where the recognition of another human being's humanity is more compelling than anything else. Stigler found that place. Brown, in his own way, found it too, holding his airplane in the air past the point where the airplane had any right to remain in the air, driven by something that was not calculation, but was instead the pure refusal to stop. That is the deepest form of respect for the people who are depending on you. The sky over the North Sea is gray in December. It has always been gray in December, and it was gray on December 20th, 1943, and somewhere in that gray, two machines that had been built to kill each other flew side by side for a few minutes before separating and going to their different fates. The machines are gone. The men are gone. The gray remains. And the story persists in the gray, not as a lesson or a moral, but as a record of what human beings are capable of on the best days of the worst years, when the worst that can be demanded is demanded of them, and they find in the demanding something that the demand had not anticipated. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the men who flew these missions and the choices they made in the sky above a continent at war, leave a comment below and tell us what you think you would have done in Stigler's position. Not the easy answer, the real one. And if you want more stories from the air war that are not in the history books because the men who lived them were too modest or too private to put them there, subscribe, because there are more of them than you think, and they are worth knowing. I'm John, and I thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I'll see you in the next video.